How's it going, guys? Thank you so much for watching this video. Now, before I get into anything, I want to thank all of you for 100 subscribers. It really means a lot. In the grand scheme of things, it's not that big of a deal, but it's obviously kind of nice to be in the triple digits as far as that goes, rather than the double digits. Hey, at least that's not my chess rating, but yeah, I just wanted to thank you all for 100 subscribers. It looks like we're growing incrementally as a channel, and hopefully we can keep this up. Now, welcome also to my new series called Rating Steps. So this series is going to be where I play games. I'm going to play the games offline or, off recording, where I play games against people of certain rating levels, and the goal essentially is to analyze the games and also come up with some common mistakes and improvement tips for players at those levels. So today we're going to be playing someone who's rated 730, and we're going to be working up. So the structure, now this isn't going to be orderly necessarily, but kind of the goal is to have, 4 games against people rated under 800, then 4 games against people rated 800 to 1000, then 4 against 1000 to 1200, and so on and so forth. And yeah, as I said, the idea is to just kind of see common mistakes and improvement points among players of those rating levels. And I am always going to be looking for opponents, most likely. So if you fall into any of the rating categories that are coming up, feel free to let me know, and I would be happy to play a game with you. And with that said, I think we will move on to the video. So I'll see you there. Alright, let's take a look at this game. I played e4, he played e5, I played knight f3. Now, I'll back up a little bit. As most of you might know, or a lot of you may know, I am normally a d4 player. However, for this video, I decided to play e4, and specifically, I decided to play the Gioco Piano main line. c3 has the idea to play d4. Now, the traditional line is to go like d3, castle, and just sort of slow play the position. However, I wanted to play this way to sort of make my opponent uncomfortable and see how they would react. And I think it's safe to say for this game, it paid off. My opponent played knight f6, which is the correct move. I played d4, and after e takes d4, c takes d4, my opponent already messed up. My opponent played the error of just playing knight takes d4, and that just simply loses a piece. So if we back up, how could he have avoided that? Well, he wanted to make the capture here. So here's my first pro tip of this video and of this whole series. Or we'll see if this is the first video I publish. I think it will be, but I'm not exactly sure. But anyway, if you want to make a capture, make sure you add up the number of attackers versus the number of defenders. And what I mean is that my d4 pawn has 2 protectors, my queen and my knight. So in theory, if it were to get captured, I would be able to recapture it with 2 different pieces. The pawn has 2 defenders as well, which means that in theory they have 2 possible pieces that could capture. Now, if the number of attackers and defenders, let's say that the number of attackers is greater. So let's say that in theory my opponent instead had played queen f6, and I went d4, and then he took and I took. He has 3 attackers, the bishop, queen, and knight. I would only have 2 protectors, the queen and knight. That means that the capture is safe, because after knight takes d4, he would make the last capture. And if I tried to take here, he'd, again, make the last capture. That's how I try to think about, by the way, when you're evaluating the number of attackers and defenders. Just try to evaluate who is the last capture. And whoever has the last capture generally succeeds. However, as we see here, the number of attackers and defenders is equal. And if it's equal, that means that the number of defenders is going to be safe. Because after knight takes d4, knight takes, bishop takes, I have the last capture. I play queen takes d4, and I'm just up a piece. So it is just something, especially if you're in that 700-800 range or even below, obviously, you want to be thinking about. Well, one, you don't want to be hanging pieces. That's definitely what I would advise. But if you're making these captures, now there are exceptions. I mean, if there's like a queen sitting there and the queen has like more defenders than attackers, but a piece of lower value can take it, you by all means want to do it. But if there's like, if it's like a piece of equal value, like pawn versus pawn, you really want to count. So my opponent just lost a piece, and I mean, it's going to be tough sledding from here. I mean, there's some more instructive moments. like here, and we'll look at this more in the next game, but you really shouldn't unnecessarily allow a pin like this, especially if I have pressure on the knight. So in theory, the best move for my opponent is h6 just to prevent the pin, but I think when you're down a piece, it's hard to play the best. And lastly, c5 in this structure is not a good positional move because long term the d5 square is weak because now a pawn can no longer support the d5 square, and so that means that my knight could get in, and also the d6 pawn is weak. Now in this game it doesn't really matter, but if it were more of an equal position, then I could just put all this pressure on the d pawn, and it can't be protected by another pawn, and you know, it going forward would be very difficult. So yeah, I just kind of cleaned house here. I played knight d5, attacking the pinned knight, and yeah, queen e5, bishop takes, forcing pawn takes, as obviously queen takes would lose the queen. I played queen h6, just pressuring f6, and there's really nothing that my opponent can do. Yeah, I'm checking the computer, it's plus 12. Then after queen e4, my opponent just, you know, hung a fork. After king h8, very important, guys, this is not checkmate because the queen protects it, so just make sure you watch for that stuff. So I just took the queen, my opponent moved their rook, and then, you know, played till checkmate. So that was that, and so let's look at game 2. Now, yeah, my opponent offered me a rematch, and I decided to accept it, as that game was pretty short. I mean, it was decided pretty quickly, so we'll look at this one as well. E4, E5. My opponent played bishop to C4, and after knight F6, he played knight C3. So far, this is very solid. What I might say, if you want to look more into your openings, is you can try to play for some sort of Vienna gambit. You could play like an immediate f4 or play like d3 f4. That's just something I would keep in mind since you already are playing bishop c4, knight c3, because you keep the option open to open the f file. Now, this isn't really the point of this video, but, you know, if you want to look into the Vienna gambit, or I don't know what the non-gambit is called. It's like knight c6, d3. It's like, okay, never mind. Anyway, you know, sorry, I don't know opening names that well, but I think it's the Vienna, but not the Vienna gambit. But anyway, this is also totally fine. You're developing all your pieces. This is totally good. Now, this is where I think the first inaccuracy was made. It might be harsh to call it a mistake, but knight g5. Now, obviously, he has a good idea with knight g5 to attack the f7 square. So an example line is like the fried liver, to where after e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4. If black plays an immediate knight f6, then this move knight g5 is very viable, because you go after f7, and then there's this line that after, like, you know, d5 takes, knight f7, you know, there's this whole sacrifice, which there is a video coming out on that, so be sure to check that out. But anyway, my opponent tried knight g5 prematurely, and why don't you take a second to pause the video? Why does knight g5 not work in this position? Alright, so if you've had a chance to pause, I can simply castle. And there's no attack to be had. My opponent castled, and it's worth noting that you could try this trade, and I used to do this a lot as a beginner, but it's actually just not a good trade. You'd be trading 2 minor pieces, which is 6 points of material, for my rook and pawn, which is also 6 points of material. However, just compare the 2 sets of pieces. Whose pieces do you think is better? I agree. I think white's pieces are just better. So after knight f7, bishop f7, king f7, note that black is dominating in development and like potential center play, for instance. And it may seem like the king is weak, but in reality, there's not a way to attack it because like your knight is there, and even if they could, you could just hide with like king g8. So it's not really worth it. My opponent either was aware of it or just, you know, wasn't aware of it. But they didn't do that. They just played castles, and then after h6, they just played knight f3. So that's another drawback of playing knight g5 prematurely, which is that if I play a move like h6, they just have to drop that back, and they essentially wasted a move. And so after d6, here I think my opponent played another mistake. They allowed this pin, and that is something I sort of alluded to in the previous game, where they dropped a piece and then they allowed this pin, because in reality, well, I'll show you the game to sort of illustrate the point. You don't really want to allow this pin, because it's not just about the pin. The pin itself is not that problematic. It's that you don't want to allow me to attack the pinned piece, because if I get like knight d4 for free, then suddenly I'm attacking your knight, and let's just play some other random moves. If I get something like this, your pawn structure is very weak. I have a bishop that's like just totally invading your kingside. This is just not a very good position. You don't want to allow me to get this pressure on your pinned knight. So with that said, it's much better, and this is just something you have to remember, and a lot of players at this level are going to forget it, but if your opponent plays a move like d6 with bishop g4 coming, you really should just play h3. h3 just to prevent bishop g4. After d6, d3, I played bishop g4, and you'll sort of see some of these themes play out. After a3, I played knight d4, putting more pressure, and here's one more, b4, bishop e6, then my opponent played h3. Now, here's one more theme that I'll sort of show here. I'm not even classifying this as a mistake for my opponent, because he's already in a bad position. Actually, the best move in this position, I can actually just take the knight and then take the pawn here. And then I'm just completely crushing for the reasons we talked about. And I'm up a pawn, so sort of adds insult to injury. However, I decide to retreat the bishop to sort of show this theme that after g4, I could retreat to g6, but that's kind of passive. I can just sack on g4. And so here's the deal. I'm sacking a piece for 2 pawns to maintain this pin. Uh-oh, my mouse is acting up. Okay, it looks like it's working now, but I sacked a knight for 2 pawns to maintain this pin. I already have a knight attacking the pinned piece, and my opponent is just toast here. And so, their knight is pinned, so obviously if they move, I take the queen, and they have no way to put further protection on the knight. And even if there was a position, like maybe my knight's still on c6, even if, there wasn't really a way for me necessarily to win the piece back, there's a lot of ideas to pressure the king side, just things like, queen f6, queen g6, things like that. So this is just something, you can add to your tactical toolbox as well, that after this move g4, you could sacrifice the knight. Like, doing this type of sacrifice is very viable, because in reality, you only lose 1 point of material, and, you open the king, you also maintain the pin. So, yeah, the best thing for my opponent to do is literally just to do something like king g2 and just sack the queen, and, like, this is losing for my opponent, but at least there's not, like, a forced mate or anything here. But anyway, my opponent just played bishop e3, I played bishop takes f3. You could go either way. It may be tempting to go knight takes f3 and go with the check, and that's totally fine. I guess I could have done that and then followed up with queen h4, but I decided to go bishop takes f3 because I just like the prospects of getting a checkmate with my bishop. And then I played queen h4. It's just going to be a forced checkmate here. There's no way to stop it. My opponent played bishop f7 just as a spite check, but after rook takes f7, bishop takes d4, I got the win with queen d1 checkmate.